What would you do if the only thing standing between you and the street was a rusted awl and the memory of a dead woman's hands? We've been sitting with that question for a while now. And we think, if you're honest with yourself, you might not have an easy answer either. Because the story we're about to share isn't about luck, or treasure, or being in the right place at the right time. It's about what a person carries with them when they have nothing left to carry. So pull up a chair. This one starts in the cold. The winter of 1923 came early to the town of Dunmore Creek, tucked somewhere between the spruce forests and the frozen lake country of northern Ontario. It wasn't a mean town, exactly. But it wasn't a kind one either. It was the kind of place where people kept their heads down and their curtains pulled and their opinions sharp as a skinner's blade. A working town. A town that measured a person's worth by what they could produce before sundown. Ivy Marsh arrived there on the 3rd of November with 37 cents in her coat pocket, a carpetbag that was more patch than original fabric, and a leather roll of bookbinding tools wrapped in oilcloth that she held against her chest the way another woman might hold a child. She was 22 years old. She had no family. She had no plan. What she had was the tools and the knowledge of how to use them, and the voice of an old woman named Beatrice Lamb still echoing somewhere in the back of her skull. Mind your stitching, Ivy. A book that falls apart is a promise you didn't keep. Beatrice Lamb had been a bookbinder in the town of Collingwood. She had taken Ivy in at 14, after Ivy's mother passed from fever, and her father had made it clear, in the quiet, brutal way men sometimes do, that a daughter was a different kind of burden than a son. Beatrice hadn't made a fuss about it. She'd handed Ivy an awl and a length of waxed linen thread and said, "You'll learn by doing same as everything." And that was that. 8 years of it. 8 years of learning how spine and board and page become something that outlasts the person who made it. Beatrice had died the previous spring. A bad heart, the doctor said. Ivy had held her hand through the last night and buried her with the help of a neighbor who barely knew either of them. The house had gone to a nephew in Barrie, who Beatrice had barely mentioned and Ivy had never met. He'd arrived on a Wednesday, and by Thursday morning Ivy was standing on the road outside with her bag and her tools and not much else. She hadn't blamed him. Not really. But she'd carried the sting of it all the way to Dunmore Creek. She found a room above the hardware store, rented from a man named Roy Pickett, who charged her 2 weeks in advance and said nothing more than stairs are at the back and no cooking after 9. The room was small and cold and smelled of turpentine. There was a window that looked out over the alley where the delivery horses stood in the mornings, breath rising in clouds. Ivy paid the 2 weeks and counted what was left. 14 cents. She needed work. That was simple enough. The less simple part was that Dunmore Creek did not appear to have a bookbinder. Nor, she quickly discovered, did it appear to want one. She went to the general store first, because it seemed like a place where people talked, and talking sometimes led to something useful. The man behind the counter, Owen Croft, was polite in the way that means absolutely nothing. He listened to her explain what she did, and then said, "Folks around here don't buy many books," which wasn't a lie but also wasn't the whole truth, and they both knew it. She tried the church. The minister, Reverend Aldous, had a shelf of hymnals behind his pulpit that were falling to pieces, their spines cracked, pages loose as autumn leaves. Ivy pointed this out gently and offered to repair them. Reverend Aldous looked at her the way people sometimes look at strangers who notice things they'd rather leave unnoticed. He said he'd pray on it. She never heard back. She tried the schoolhouse. The teacher, a young man named Philip Graves, who looked barely older than she was, had textbooks in such disrepair that some of the children were sharing pages torn from different copies. He seemed genuinely interested. Then he told her the school board controlled the budget and she'd have to submit a written request and wait for the quarterly meeting, which was in February. It was November. Ivy walked back to her room above the hardware store and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the oilcloth roll of tools on the table. The awl Beatrice had given her was at the top. Bone handle, slightly yellowed, the tip still sharp because Ivy sharpened it. Every Sunday morning, the way Beatrice had taught her, same as church for some people. She picked it up, turned it in her fingers. You'll learn by doing. Same as everything. She wasn't going to wait until February. There was a woman in Dunmore Creek named Frances Lode who ran the town's only lending library out of the front room of her house on Birch Street. It wasn't an official library. It wasn't funded by anyone. It was just Frances Lode's obsession made physical. 400 and some books arranged on shelves she'd built herself, available to anyone in town who would treat them with respect and return them on time. People in town found Frances Lode mildly peculiar. She was 61, widowed, and had the particular confidence of a woman who had long ago stopped caring what anyone thought of her choices. She walked to the post office every morning regardless of weather. She kept a large gray cat named Edmund, who sat in the window and watched the street. She had opinions about everything, and shared them when asked and sometimes when not. Ivy found the library by accident. She was walking down Birch Street, looking for the woman someone had told her mended coats, when she saw the small painted sign above a front door. Books lent freely to those who return them faithfully. She stopped. Then she knocked. Frances Lode opened the door, looked Ivy up and down in exactly the way a woman who has survived long enough to trust her instincts does, and said, "You look like you need tea before you need anything else." She wasn't wrong. Inside, the front room smelled of paper and wood smoke and something faintly like dried lavender. Books stood everywhere, on shelves, stacked on the floor in careful towers, piled on the window ledge around Edmund, who had arranged himself among them like a small gray sovereign. Ivy stood in the middle of it and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't even known was wound tight. Over tea, she told Frances Lode her situation. Not all of it, but enough. The bookbinding training, Beatrice, the tools, the 14 cents, the reverend who would pray on it, and the school board that met in February. Frances listened without interrupting, which was a courtesy not everyone extended. Then she said, "Come here," and led Ivy to a shelf in the back corner, where a row of books sat in varying states of collapse. Covers buckling, boards detaching, one so badly warped it could barely close. "These are the ones I can't lend anymore," she said. "People bring them back and I don't have the heart to throw them out, but they're not much use to anyone in this condition." Ivy picked up the nearest one, ran her thumb along the damaged spine, felt where the sections had separated from the adhesive. She looked at Frances Lode. "I can fix these," she said. Frances looked at her steadily. "I know you can," she said. "The question is what you need in return." What Ivy needed in return was use of the back table and access to the small iron stove that kept the room warm. Frances provided both. She also, quietly and without drawing attention to it, began telling people that she had a bookbinder working out of her lending library, should anyone have need of such a thing. The first week, nothing came. Ivy worked on Frances's damaged books. She used the tools from Beatrice's roll, the bone folder, the sewing frame, the small brass knocking down iron she used to press the spines flat. The awl she used for piercing signatures, that soft, precise tap-tap through folded pages, the sound of it familiar enough that it settled her breathing. The work was slow and required her full attention, which was, in its own way, a mercy. When her hands were busy, she wasn't thinking about 14 cents or what happened in February, or the way Roy Pickett looked through her when she passed him on the stairs. The second week, a woman named Dolly Price came in with a Bible so old the leather cover had cracked along the spine and the text block was pulling free entirely. She held it out to Ivy with a kind of careful formality, the way you hand someone something sacred. "Can anything be done?" she asked. Ivy examined it. The pages were sound. The binding was the problem. The original was long past saving, but the book itself could be rehoused entirely. New boards, new leather spine if she could source it, the original pages sewn back onto new tapes and set in a proper case. She explained this to Dolly Price and quoted a price. Dolly looked at the Bible, then at Ivy. "That's my grandmother's," she said. "I know," Ivy said. "I'll take care of it." She did. It took 4 days and every scrap of concentration she had, because the pages were fragile and the sewing had to be fine enough not to stress them further. When Dolly Price came to collect it, she held the rebound book in both hands for a long moment without speaking. Then she opened it to the first page where her grandmother's handwriting was still visible. She closed it again. She looked at Ivy. Something in her face had shifted. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. 8 years, Ivy said. Dolly Price nodded slowly. "Then you're the real thing," she said. Word, after that, moved the way it moves in small towns, person to person, over back fences and at the counter of Owen Croft's general store, mentioned between the ordering of flour and the discussion of weather. The school teacher Philip Graves came back on his own, without waiting for the school board, and brought 3 readers in pieces and paid for the repair out of his own pocket. The barber's shop had a collection of almanacs that needed attention. A farmer came in from 12 miles out with a ledger book his father had kept, the binding shot, every page of it filled with 40 years of careful notation. Acres planted, yields, births of animals, deaths of animals, the whole arithmetic of a life lived on the land. He didn't say much. He just set it on the table and stood back. Ivy looked at it, looked at him. "This one will take a week," she said. He nodded. "Take what you need," he said. By the end of November, she had paid Roy Pickett for another 2 weeks and had enough left over to buy flour and salt pork and a small bag of coffee, which she counted as a luxury she had earned. The room still smelled of turpentine. The window still looked over the alley, but it felt different to stand in it now. She was sitting at the back table one Thursday afternoon, pressing a newly cased book under a wooden board, weighted with a stack of Francis's thickest volumes, when Francis came in from the front and said, without preamble, "Ida Cutter is here." The name meant nothing to Ivy. Francis pressed her lips together in a way that suggested it should. "She's the one who owns the building on the corner of Cutter and Main, the old Hartwell building, the one that's been standing empty for 3 years since her husband died." Ivy waited. "She says she needs something restored," Francis said. "Won't say what. She wants to speak to you directly." Ida Cutter was perhaps 70, with the erect posture of a woman who had decided decades ago that the world would have to come to her. She wore good clothes that were not new. She had clear gray eyes that moved over Ivy with the same assessing calm that Francis had used at the door, but with more edge to it. She had brought a box, wooden, about the size of a bread tin, sealed with a small brass latch. She set it on the table and did not open it immediately. She looked at Ivy instead. "How long have you been in Dunmore Creek?" she said. 3 weeks, Ivy said. "Where before?" "Collingwood. I trained under Beatrice Lamb." Something moved across Ida Cutter's face, not quite recognition, but close to it. "I knew a woman named Lamb," she said, "years ago. Good woman." "She was," Ivy said. Ida Cutter opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white and was now the color of old paper, was a book, or what had been a book. The coverboards had separated entirely and lay beside the text block like shed wings. The spine was gone. The pages, Ivy leaned in, careful not to touch yet. The pages were handwritten, all of them. Dense columns of figures and dates and names, the ink faded to a pale brown but still legible. "That was my husband's," Ida Cutter said. "His personal ledger, 40 years of business records. Every transaction this family made, going back to when he first opened the mill." She paused. "His father's entries are in there too. The last 60 pages. Ivy carefully lifted one board, set it down. "The binding failed," she said. "But the pages are intact, every one of them. Can you restore it? I can rehouse it entirely. New boards, new spine, new sewing. The original pages preserved inside." Ida Cutter was quiet for a moment. "There's a legal matter," she said finally. "My husband's business partner, a man named Douglas Fell, claims my husband agreed to sell him the mill at a price far below its value 2 months before he died. Douglas Fell says there was a written agreement." She looked at Ivy directly. "There was no such agreement. The ledger proves it. Every major transaction my husband entered, he recorded. There is no record of this sale. Not a word of it. You've shown the ledger to a lawyer. I've shown him what I can get him to look at. But in this condition," she gestured at the separated boards, "the loose pages, he says it's too fragile to submit as evidence. Says the court may not accept it." She said it flatly, without anger, which was somehow worse than anger. "The hearing is in 8 weeks. Ivy looked at the ledger, then at Ida Cutter. 2 weeks, she said. "I'll need 2 weeks. She started that evening and barely left the back table for the first 3 days. The work was the most exacting she had ever done. The pages were fragile in the way that old handwritten documents are fragile. Not from any single weakness, but from the accumulation of time. Each page slightly different in its degree of brittleness. Each requiring its own judgment about how much pressure to apply, where to support, where not to touch at all. She worked with her hands close to her body, movements small and deliberate. The awl she used to pierce the signatures was Beatrice's, the one with the bone handle, and there were moments when the rhythm of the piercing, that soft, careful tap, the resistance of the paper, the release, felt less like tool use and more like something she'd been taught in another language and was only now beginning to speak fluently. Francis brought her tea and didn't ask questions. Francis had the particular wisdom of someone who has watched enough people work to know when the work itself is the conversation. Ivy resealed the entire text block on new linen tapes. She made new boards from the best stock she could find. Francis had a small supply she'd been keeping against need, dense gray board that was nothing fancy but would hold for decades. The new spine she covered in a dark blue cloth that was the closest thing to the original color she could approximate. Then she pressed it, weighted and clamped for 48 hours. When she uncased it, the ledger opened flat and clean and square. The pages breathed, the spine held. The writing inside was as legible as it had ever been. 80-some years of Cutter family commerce, clear and uninterrupted from the first page to the last. There was, as Ida Cutter had said, no record of any agreement with Douglas Fell. Ivy delivered it on a Tuesday afternoon. She carried it wrapped in clean brown paper and tied with linen twine, and she walked to Ida Cutter's house on the south end of Birch Street, which was a large house that had the look of a place where real decisions had been made. Ida Cutter answered the door herself. She didn't open the package in front of Ivy. She held it in both hands, for a moment the way Dolly Price had held her grandmother's Bible. Then she looked up. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." They sat in the front parlor, which was a room with good furniture that had been used and a fire that had been burning for a while. Ida Cutter unwrapped the ledger and opened it slowly, moving through the pages with a care that told Ivy she had done this before, many times, sitting with this same book in better days. She came to the last entry her husband had made. Stopped. She didn't cry. She wasn't that kind of woman. But her hand rested on the page for a long moment, and Ivy looked at the fire and let her have it. "My husband built that mill from nothing," Ida Cutter said eventually. "His father before him. Douglas Fell was his partner for 11 years, and he never once put in what he took out." She closed the ledger. "He thought I wouldn't fight. Thought an old widow wouldn't know how." She looked at Ivy with those clear gray eyes. "He was wrong," she said. The hearing was 6 weeks later. Ivy was not there for it. She heard about it, the way she heard about most things by then. From Francis, who had heard from Dolly Price, who had heard from the minister's wife, who had been told by the lawyer's secretary. The ledger was admitted as evidence. The restoration had been done to a standard the lawyer described, in a letter he later sent to Ida Cutter, as exceptional workmanship. The record spoke for itself. There was no agreement. Douglas Fell's claim was dismissed. The mill stayed in Ida Cutter's name. Ivy was at the back table when Francis came in with the news, pressing the almanacs for the barber. She listened, set down the folder, picked it up again. "Good," she said. Francis gave her a look that had several things in it at once. "Ida Cutter has asked me to pass something along," she said. She set an envelope on the table. Inside was a sum of money that was, by Ivy's careful accounting, 3 times what she had charged for the restoration, and a note, written in a hand that was economical and precise, for the work, and for doing it right. "There is a room above the Hartwell building on Cutter and Main that has been standing empty since my husband died. It has good north light, and it is yours for a fair rent if you want it." Ivy read the note twice. Then she set it down and looked at Beatrice Lamb's awl, where it lay at the edge of the table, bone handle up, the way she always set it when she was working, so she could find it by feel without looking. She thought about standing on that road outside Beatrice's house in Collingwood, bag in one hand and the oilcloth roll in the other, not knowing yet which direction was the right one. She thought about Ida Cutter's face when she'd said, "He thought I wouldn't fight." There was something in that, something worth turning over and keeping. She took the room. It did have good north light. 2 large windows that faced the kind of flat Ontario sky that is white in winter and a particular shade of pale blue in the brief summer. The kind of light that doesn't flatter anything but shows everything clearly, which is exactly what you want when you're working with your hands on something that matters. She moved in on a Saturday. The oilcloth roll of tools went on the work table first, the awl with the bone handle in its place at the top. She unpacked everything else around it. The bone folder, the knocking down iron, the sewing frame, the little brass bodkin, and stood for a moment looking at them laid out in order, each one worn smooth in the places where hands had held it for years. Beatrice's hands first, then hers. She thought about what Francis had said, early on, when Ivy had asked her why she kept books that were too damaged to lend. Because someone made them, Francis had said, and something that someone made with care deserves the chance to keep going. Ivy had been binding books for 8 years by then. She had never thought about it quite that way. But she thought about it now, standing in the room on Cutter and Main, with the light coming in and the tools on the table, and Dunmore Creek going about its business on the street below. A book that falls apart is a promise you didn't keep. She hadn't. People in Dunmore Creek would talk about Ivy Marsh for years afterward, the way small towns talk about people who surprise them. Some said she was lucky. Some said she was clever. Some said it was the Cutter case that made her. And there was truth in that. The way there is truth in the fact that a key makes a lock turn. It matters, but only if you're already holding it. What we know, and we've sat with this story long enough to feel sure of it, is that when Ivy arrived in Dunmore Creek with 37 cents and a carpetbag and a dead woman's tools, she didn't arrive with nothing. She arrived with 8 years of doing things right when it would have been easier to do them fast. She arrived with the habit of precision and the discipline of care and the knowledge, deep in her hands, that the thing you're making will outlast the moment you're making it in. Douglas Fell had assumed that an old widow wouldn't know how to fight. He'd made the same mistake about Ivy. Without even meeting her, he'd looked at what was missing, the money, the name, the connections, and missed entirely what was there. That's the thing about people like Ida Cutter and Ivy Marsh. They're easy to underestimate, right up until the moment you can't anymore. Francis Lode's lending library on Birch Street kept lending books for another 20 years, until Francis died at 83 and left the collection to the town, which eventually housed it in a proper building that still stands. Edmund the cat died some years before Francis, which she considered a loss of the first order and said so to anyone who mentioned it. The ledger Ivy restored sat in Ida Cutter's parlor for the rest of Ida's life, and after that passed to her daughter and was eventually donated to a local historical society where it sits in an archival box and can be examined by appointment. Someone did the right kind of work on it, once, you can tell. And if you ever find yourself in the lake country of northern Ontario, in one of those towns that keep their heads down and their curtains pulled, and you walk into a room that smells of paper and old wood and something faintly like lavender, and there's a woman at a back table working on something with her hands, something careful and slow, something that no one asked her to do but she's doing right anyway, you'll know what you're looking at. What would you have done if you were Ivy that November morning, with 14 cents and a dead woman's tools and a whole town deciding whether or not you were worth their time? We'd love to know. Tell us in the comments. And if you know someone who's ever had to prove themselves in a room that didn't want to believe them, share this with them. They might need to hear it today.